I wrote this book specifically about Luke's story of the Nativity, and I wanted to set it apart from Matthew's story. We have two stories that have come down to us in our Christian tradition. We have the manger from the Gospel of Luke, and we have the angels who are mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, though never said to be there at the manger. We have the shepherds who are from the Gospel of Luke. So we put all of them at the birth of Jesus, but then we add in the star, which is not mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, but only in the Gospel of Matthew. Then we put in the wise men, also from the Gospel of Matthew. So the image we have of Christmas, the story we have of Christmas, is this harmonization, this amalgam of the two stories, which is, it's a wonderful story, but it's a shame because we've lost the distinctive story that each individual Gospel writer told. For example, Luke focuses almost exclusively on Mary. Mary is the one who makes the decisions, who has interesting things to say. Joseph, in Luke's story, says and does almost nothing except go to Bethlehem because that's where his family comes from. Matthew, on the other hand, focuses almost exclusively on Joseph. They have different genealogies. Both say that Jesus is descended from King David, but actually trace that descent through two entirely different families. And so this suggests that Jesus has very different family backgrounds. The reason why they're in Bethlehem, Matthew and Luke don't agree on that. Luke says that they're there because of this census. They went because of this census and just happened to be in Bethlehem when Jesus was born. Matthew, on the other hand, seems to assume that Jesus' family simply came from Bethlehem. That's why he was born there. And then Matthew has to explain why it is that Jesus eventually ended up far away in Galilee, living and growing up in Nazareth. So they're very different stories. And I wanted to honor Luke's unique approach, unique voice, because I believe he has some very important things to say with his story. He's trying to get across to us important truths about who Jesus was, what he came to do by telling the story in this way, and we need to rediscover that.
Well, Mary, here we are. It's been a long, hard trip, but we finally arrived at the land that once belonged to my family. What happened? How did your family lose it? The usual way. They couldn't pay their bills, the family was starving. They borrowed money they knew that they never pay back. And you lost everything. Ended up without a home, living as carpenters in Nazareth, far, far from home. But now I'm back, and we'll see what happens now.
Well, I think the first thing we need to remember is that Luke is writing for a church. He's writing for a church. One thing he's trying to tell them is who Jesus is, what he came to do, and he's also trying to tell them right here, right at the beginning, how they ought to live as followers of Christ in the world. Remember, Luke is a gospel writer. He's writing to pass on the good news about who Jesus was and what he came to do and how to follow him. Well, Luke sets the birth of Jesus really kind of specifically during some very specific events. A census that we know about that was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, which was really about incorporating the province of Judea into the province of Syria. It was about bringing Judea into the Roman Empire in a very real way. And there's an opposition over against that into what Jesus will talk about, what will become a major focus of Jesus' ministry, this kingdom of God. And so there's this opposition that runs throughout the gospel between the kingdom of Caesar, or the empire of Caesar, and the kingdom of God. And it's for followers, the followers of Jesus, to work out how they can live between the domination of Caesar and the domination of God in the kingdom of God. It's that question that Jesus gets asked. Is it legal for us to pay our taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus kind of hedging answer, well, you need to give to Caesar what is Caesar's and you need to give to God what is God. That's the difficult situation that these early Christians found themselves into. How do we sort out our obligations to Caesar? How do we sort out our obligations to God? Where do we live in the midst of that? That's what he's getting at by talking about this whole historical situation in which Jesus is born.
Glad Congratulations, Mary.
But in the year of the census, they suddenly had big developments to talk about.
Jubilee! Jubilee! It's the year of Jubilee! Jubilee!
Okay, well, the Jubilee is an Old Testament festival. And this is also connected to Luke reaching into the Old Testament to make sense of who Jesus is and what he came to do. It was about rebalancing the economy. It was about putting together, the families of Israel were supposed to live based on what God had given them, and God had given them the land. Over time, families lost their land, they lost their freedom, they fell into debt. The Jubilee was about fixing that and making sure that families had what they needed to go forward. And so as throughout the whole Gospel of Luke, there is this idea that this is what Jesus came to accomplish. He came to establish some kind of Jubilee, not exactly like what they celebrated in the Old Testament, but that he came to create this Jubilee. And people have long recognized that Luke is particularly interested in the idea of Jubilee in his Gospel. By using this historical situation that he describes and saying that Jesus was born in the midst of it, that he was born in the midst of an administrative act of the Romans to count the people, that he was born in the midst of the celebration of a Jubilee, which was about God giving back to the people what they needed to survive, that he seems to describe this birth of Jesus taking place in the midst of an open rebellion. Because Luke knows about a rebellion that took place at the time of this census that he describes. By saying that Jesus' birth happened in the midst of that, and by saying that Mary and Joseph made a choice, and I believe what he's saying is that they made a choice to obey God. So basically what Luke is doing is he's showing Mary and Joseph, these parents of Jesus, working through these very difficult decisions about who do you follow? Do you follow Caesar? Do you follow the emperor, the civic authority, the system of this world, or do you follow God? Do you choose to follow God and what God's demands are? So what it means for us is we're faced with those decisions all the time. We live in this world and this system that we live in that often leads to good things, but also leads to bad things. We live in a capitalist system, for example, that brings us all kinds of benefits and all kinds of wonderful gadgets and creates jobs and allows us to live. But it's a system that also creates winners and losers, that creates sometimes injustices. So we're living in an imperfect system. And is our obedience simply to that system that we live in, this world system that we live in, or how do we somehow find a way of, while we continue to live in this world, how do we find a way to obey God and God's demands on how we ought to live and how we ought to work out our lives? Luke shows Mary and Joseph sorting very actively through this very issue that continues to plague us and bother us to this very day. And that's what makes the story, their story, of this journey to Bethlehem so meaningful to me now as I've come to understand these things.